Live from New York, this is the Ground Truth Podcast, your weekly dose of AI news and insights with Adam Wenchel and John Dickerson.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 6 of Ground Truth with my co-host John Dickerson. We're joining you live today to talk about one topic and one topic only, because it's one that I think we're really excited about, and I think everyone else should be too. And that's OpenAI dropping their brand new O1 model, which if you haven't played around with it yet, go play around with it. It's pretty impressive. We've known this was coming for a while. We've kind of followed the research, but seeing it actually in action is pretty neat. And, you know, breakthroughs on just a number of tasks. I don't know, John, are you as excited about this as I am?
Yeah, I mean, you and I were talking before we started recording about whether or not this was a bigger drop than ChatGPT back in November, I guess, 30th of 2022. And I don't think it's as big, but it is a huge step forward. So I've not been this excited, I would say, about a new model drop since that November 30th of 2022 when ChatGPT came out.
I think for me, I had played, you kind of saw the text models getting slightly better and slightly better. It was a big jump forward when ChatGPT launched, but I guess I have personally not seen as many of the baby steps around reasoning as maybe you have being in the community.
Yeah, I mean, this is a discussion we can obviously get into about reasoning in general and the attachment of reasoning to Gen AI-based models. But this is clearly a huge step forward in specifically what you might call multi-step planning or reasoning. And, we can anger people on Twitter about whether or not this is actually doing reasoning or planning, but it's a step forward, and at least the benchmarks that are associated with those styles of tasks, like STEM style benchmarks, math, programming, and so on. As well as, both you and I obviously playing around with this over the weekend, from a vibes point of view as well, it clearly is doing more of what I would call planning or reasoning than before.
Absolutely. No, it's this model was nicknamed Strawberry, right, when it was in development because of inspired by the one of the sort of infamous examples that trips up most LLMs, which is how many R's are in the word strawberry. And that's like child's play for this model. Breaks it down into a step-by-step problem and solves it in 10 seconds.
I will say Noam Brown, one of the foundational members of this team, it's a team of about, I think it was 30 or 40 foundational members, and then a whole lot of other OpenAI contributors, obviously, made the claim on Twitter that this was not called Strawberry because of that. That was just a happy coincidence that they weren't able to solve this simple counting problem until now.
Interesting. So we haven't even gotten to the predictions part, and I'm already getting it wrong, huh?
I have a history of doing pretty poorly with predictions as well. I was thinking maybe we kick this off with just a really high-level overview of some of the techniques that created the advancement for O1 over, for example, the most recent model prior to that, GPT-4o. And the advancements here are in something called post-training. So when you think about post-training, you can imagine this from the words themselves. You've now trained some sort of base model, and some post-training you can kind of futz around with some of the weights in the models or the system around it to adjust behavior in particular ways. And so some examples of post-training, like RLHF, this reinforcement learning from human feedback, which nominally looks into aligning a model that has already been trained with particular human preferences, or other forms like direct preference optimization, which is now used instead of the base RLHF methods to do that same thing. So you have this model that you've trained, and now you want to do some additional work in post-training to improve answers and so on. And so the advancements here are via the use of something called reinforcement learning. And that reinforcement learning is attached onto something else called chain of thought optimization, basically. So this is this idea that you can have multiple steps, multiple interactions via prompt and then output from the model, a chain of these interactions to get the model to progress toward a final output that is maybe more correct or more understandable than it would have otherwise with a single prompt. And so prior to the techniques that are used here in the O1 Mini and O1 Preview releases, this was typically done in a very sort of hacky manual way. And so Adam and I were talking about how, this looks very static. It's very, very, it's something where you have to, as a human, sit down and think about how am I going to convince the model to start thinking in the right direction, not to anthropomorphize these things, to get a good output. And there are some libraries, the most commonly used is something called DSPy, that help you with this optimization. They're optimizing single prompts even for a particular model in an automated or semi-automated way. But it's still pretty early days on that. And so what OpenAI is claiming that they've done, and obviously they have a history of not releasing all of the details or even all of the correct details about the way that they're training things, but this is roughly what folks think they're doing, is they're wrapping this sort of optimization over the chain of these different prompt interactions with a model in a loop that allows you to sort of learn to search toward high reward outputs. And so from an RL, or reinforcement learning point of view, what they're doing is, there are a bunch of states of the world: intermediary states where I haven't given a final answer, and then final states where I spit out the final answer. There are 3 R's in strawberry or whatever. And I can associate some sort of reward with being in those particular states, higher being better, higher being more correct. And then I can act by choosing different prompts, different paths, different steps in my path, different steps in my chain of thought to hopefully move toward areas of high reward, move toward states that are more correct. And so this was all done in post training, and it's really made some huge steps forward in terms of specifically reasoning in STEM, like math and programming and so on.
Very cool. Yeah, and so some of the examples that they published, were pretty compelling, right? So there was, in addition to the basic how many R's are in strawberry, one of the ones that we had a lot of fun, my son and I had a lot of fun playing around this weekend, was a cipher task that they threw at it, where it was a basic substitution, but it was actually one of the more, I would say, a relatively complicated basic letter substitution, which is for each letter you want to encode, you would represent it with 2 letters, and if you average the ordinal number of those 2 letters, that would give you the encoded letter. So an example, if you want to encode the letter D, you could put a C and an E. So D is the 4th letter in the alphabet. You encode it with the 3rd and the 5th letter of the alphabet, and so halfway between them is the letter. And you could also do like the 2nd and the 6th, or as long as it averages out to that number. And so for any given letter, there's anywhere from like 1 to 13 or 14 different encodings for that letter. And so if you can imagine, like it's not a simple 1-for-1, right? You have to identify that you're doing a 2 letters to 1 letter mapping, and then figure out the kind of simple algorithm behind it, which is this averaging function. And I gave it to my son, who took a college level cryptology course this summer, and they had taught them some really solid fundamental approaches to cracking these ciphers, and so he went to work and was able to solve it relatively quickly, but through a series of very methodical steps. And then we looked at the blog post, and the amazing thing to me was the algorithm broke it down into basically the exact same process that he had been taught to go after it with. And the other amazing thing was in the steps that they showed, one of the steps it actually gets wrong, and it goes a little further down the plan, and it's having trouble. It's not resolving to plain text. And so amazingly, it says, I must have messed up one of the earlier steps, and it goes back, rechecks it, finds its error, and then solves it correctly. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, actually that backtracking brings up one of the first sort of suspicions people have, which is that beyond the sort of pure reinforcement learning based release that the OpenAI blog talks about, that behind the scenes there's some sort of actual sort of what's called tree search, which allows the model to think forward, and then if a particular set of steps, part of the chain of thought is not looking promising, and their promising is quantitatively defined as some estimate of the final reward of going down that particular chain of thought, you're able to backtrack, you're able to take steps back up the tree and then go down a different path. And I don't think they talked about any of this publicly, but a lot of people have a hunch that, especially given some of the hiring that they've done for people who are sort of famous for this style of approach, that's also happening behind the scenes. And one thing about this is, toward Adam's point, if we have these very sort of difficult problems where you can go down a multiple steps path that is ultimately not going to lead to a good result, this is just going to require a ton of computation at inference time to really sort of expand down that tree, to expand those long chains of thought, those long set of steps that you're trying to ultimately reach a state that isn't good enough. You're going to start burning a ton of computation there. And so, Adam, I think you were telling me about a different crypto problem, a harder crypto problem that you were playing around with, where this couldn't solve it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the kind of next level up in sort of, advancements in cryptography is what's called a Playfair cipher, which uses essentially a 5x5 grid, 2-dimensional grid of letters to encode with. State of the art in 1854 by Lord Playfair. So 170 years old and going strong. Obviously, well represented in. I'm sure it's represented in the training set. It's like plenty of Wikipedia writings about it and things like that. And that flummoxed it. It could not handle that at all. And so it was impressive, but it still can't solve state of the art 1854 encryption yet.
Yeah, but with more compute, if it is actually doing this sort of tree search, and if it's able to express the possible states of what crypto looks like behind the scenes, I would fully expect it to be able to solve that. And so, behind the scenes, surely the well-funded OpenAI is pushing the boundaries on how much computation you can feed into this.
Yeah.
Total aside there, though, you mentioned the Lord Playfair in the 1850s. Something must have been in the water in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. I love how there are all these folks, fancy, whatever, royalty or famous authors as well, who also just happened to, vomit out some cool crypto or some cool logic or some cool math as well, right? Like one of the other fun examples there is Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. He's also very famous in something called computational social choice, or like voting theory. So he's done a ton of work in the creation of voting rules and understanding how voting works, which now actually is fundamental in the alignment of AI systems. And so that was, I think, around like the 1850s, 1860s as well.
Wow. Yeah, I think Lord Playfair, I don't know what his need for secrecy was, but he was clearly interested in sending messages to someone and not divulging what was in them. So interesting. I will say, like on other, some of the linguistic tasks like that, how many R's in strawberries, we tried to up the ante there with tasks like how many letters, that would take additional planning steps. So from how many R's in a strawberry to how many letters are repeated in the word strawberry to things like how many letters are repeated in the pluralized form of the word strawberry, and kind of kept upping like the steps, and those it nailed. And so I think we got tired of coming up with questions about strawberries before it stopped answering them. So those kind of tasks it did quite well on.
Think about the greenhouse gases that
that's
from that. Yeah, so like we were mentioning, a lot of the metrics here. So this model release actually it's not totally dominating even GPT-4o, the prior model that doesn't do this sort of post training with RL. There are tasks where humans still prefer the outputs of those older models to these newer ones. So if you go to, for example, livebench.ai, or livebench.com, one of the two, you can see some of these examples of benchmarks where this model is not doing as well. So some summarization tasks or traditional natural language. But toward Adam's examples with crypto and counting R's and strawberry and so on, and solving some of these combinatorial issues, where this thing is dominating are on these quantitative benchmarks. And so over the weekend, a lot of people in computation programming actually are sort of freaking out a little bit because you can just go on to the UI on OpenAI's, ChatGPT or whatever it's called these days, and solve top coding problems. And so, it's kind of bittersweet in the sense that, if you played chess, you went through this. If you played Go, you went through this. If you played poker, you went through this as well. Where now anyone can just come on and do much better than you, who has trained for thousands or tens of thousands of hours, can do on these on these competition problems.
Yeah, I saw a user on X posting that, given it's something like the Norwegian version of the test Mensa uses to test new members, and it basically an IQ test, and it had scored 120 IQ on this test, which was I think 30 points higher than previous LLMs were able to score. 120 IQ, that's not bad.
Well, that's not going to help the Norwegians with their seasonal depression this winter.
Oh, man.
I mean, this goes along with so Terence Tao, I think definitely the most famous mathematician of our time, Fields Medal winner, super famous in harmonic analysis and number theory, has a really long thread, I think, on Mastodon talking about playing around with OpenAI's.
Is anyone still on Mastodon?
Apparently, Terence Tao is on Mastodon.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. And actually, apparently, total aside, so Mastodon and Blue Sky, Twitter competitors, saw a big spike actually in registrations recently because of Brazil moving to outlaw Twitter or X in Brazil. And so I think maybe it was Blue Sky saw a spike of 1 million new users as all of Brazil had to migrate off.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But Terence Tao, and he's getting a little bit dragged for this comment, in that thread, states explicitly the experience of using OpenAI seemed roughly on par with trying to advise a mediocre but not completely incompetent graduate student. And so this is coming from, math professors not known for being forgiving. This is coming from, arguably one of the smartest, at least mathematicians of our time. And, he's not saying that this is solving everything, but like maybe there is now value at the absolute top end of pure STEM fields for using these sorts of models, which is both scary and cool.
Yeah. So where does this? So a year from now, when OpenAI's got 100,000 Blackwell GPUs stacked up in their data centers, running for a couple months, where does this go?
Yeah, I mean, you and I were talking about this before the podcast as well, Adam. It's it's bittersweet, it's scary, it's exciting, it's all of these things, and there is a new scaling law which is in post training, and I think OpenAI talks about this in their blog post as well, which is we can start jamming a bunch of H100s, H200s, Blackwell, etc. Hardware to not just train these newer models, but also find that path that takes you from the initial output to the correct output for very hard problems. And I think we're going to start seeing, right now we're focusing obviously on benchmarks, but like we're going to start seeing open problems that aren't in these quantitative benchmarks that the AI community likes to look at start falling from this style of approach. And so what that means is, open problems in the academic literature, open problems potentially in drug design. We've talked about in prior podcasts how I think one of the most exciting, areas in the next year or even 5 years is going to be in the life sciences and the use of these models to help do drug design or, the creation of new mechanical things, mechanism design, things like that. I think we're going to see that for one. Two is, we're going to see open source implementations of this come out. You can bet that Meta has a lot of RL experience as well. You can bet that their teams are working on this, and they're going to, in the way that they have been releasing open models as a moat, they'll release open source tooling around this as well. And so,
when do you think I was going to ask you about that. When do you think that's coming out? When do you think those will drop? Next couple months?
Almost certainly behind the scenes, there have been more than one team thinking about this kind of thing, because it is sort of an obvious area of focus, which is not just pre-training, not just training, but also do the post-training and think, right? Think in an intelligent way would be the anthropomorphized way of saying this.
And everyone's known for a year OpenAI's been working on this. So
exactly, yeah. They haven't been silent about this. And so, we'll see something from Meta, I'm sure, soon.
Yeah. That'll be fun.
One thing that is going to do, though, I mean, that's going to ignite even more of this discussion around export controls and, are we releasing something that is good for the U.S., good for the Western world, and so on. And so, it will be interesting to see what the regulatory landscape looks like.
An evergreen topic for sure.
Yeah. Both Sam Altman and the Anthropic folks have been much more open about saying that they're working directly with the U.S. government at this point to pre-release models and show what their models are doing, including for this O1 release. Sam Altman was on X explicitly saying, hey, we've shown this to, quote unquote, the government. And so going to keep happening. Yeah,
what do you think? I mean, just to revisit a topic of conversation from a few months ago, at one point there was this a bit of a growing feeling that the U.S. government could actually go as far as stepping in and nationalizing OpenAI or one of these labs. What do you think? Think that's going to happen?
It could happen. I mean, you need to make sure the investors and the employees and Sam Altman and Satya and all these other people were made good in terms of dollars, right? And so I don't see a world where USG comes in and takes over in a ham-fisted, heavy-handed way one of the darling companies, if not the darling company of our time in the U.S., because that would obviously have no precedence, very little precedence from the U.S., and also clearly a chilling effect on any sort of innovation in our country. But I could see them taking steps toward it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you really believe that this trend line can continue over the next year or two, then it's certainly not impossible to imagine.
The scaling laws have scaled, and just to be blunt here, and there's. A priori, there's no immediate reason to believe that this post-training stuff won't scale for quite a while as well. And one thing we didn't touch on actually is the discussion around this chain of thought. In some sense, does make these models more understandable in what they're doing, right? So now I can see, for those of you who haven't played around with these tools yet, I would encourage you to go on and see, what Adam was talking about the model taking steps forward and then realizing it's not, going in a good direction, taking a step backward, and so on. Each one of those steps, though, is in some sense more understandable to a human than just input, black box, output. And so OpenAI talks about this a little bit, and we're going to see more of this as the open source implementations of these tools come out. talks about how you can use that actually to do model debugging. You can use that to do some forms of alignment better. And this is their claim, at least, is this is why they're not releasing some of the intermediary steps publicly to the end user, in part for competitive advantage, but in part because it allows them to do AI safety stuff better. So this is why I'm excited for the open source output, because we're actually going to start being able to explore what these things look like in a public way. That's one, but two, I will make the comment that this new O1 release was jailbroken within 24 hours, I think by applying either prompter or somebody like that. And so clearly the safety is still lacking.
Jailbroken to do anything in particular, or just to show that you could jailbreak it?
I can't remember the example, but it was one of these make a nuclear bomb or make a bioweapon or whatever.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's comforting.
Awesome. Yeah, any predictions on your end, Adam, on where we're going to be in a year with this?
For starters, it's shocking to me that this has received so little news coverage for as big as it is. I don't know. I'm a little bit surprised. I think maybe just people have generative AI fatigue or something, but this is a huge one. So I think that you're going to see this second wave of innovation around generative AI, which basically combines reasonings and agents to just perform the step change in the world in terms of what you can automate. So I think over the next 2 years, you're just going to see kind of a sea change in terms of the way companies operate and that people get stuff done.
Yeah, I guess for once we agree with each other. So I guess maybe to close it out, you definitely encourage you to hop on to O1 Preview or even O1 Mini, which is a sort of smaller model, and ask it hard questions, right? Ask it questions from your PhD thesis, right? Ask it questions that you've been banging your head against the wall for a week on in terms of coding or in terms of any sort of reasoning task that you have, and it's not going to be right. Sometimes it will be, more often than you would expect.
Yeah, did you see that one YouTube video where a PhD student, this PhD student basically prompted it to, he's been working on this research project for a year, writing thousands of lines of code and doing all this analysis, and O1 did basically the same thing in an hour.
Yeah, it's bittersweet, I'm sure.
Yeah, no question. All right, well, that's a wrap of this special edition of Ground Truth O1 edition. Congrats to the OpenAI team for another great launch, and I'm really excited to see how this plays out over the next few months.
Yeah, excited to see the open source world catch up as well, because we're going to see some really cool experimentation coming out there.